Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the Swine Feed Additive Summit by Wisenetics, an event specially designed for swine nutritionists, where we will discuss the latest industry updates brought to you directly from the world's top leading additive suppliers. Our goal here is to provide you with everything you need to know to stay up to date with the latest research in the field without having to leave your home. We believe and hope this event will prepare you for market challenges. I'm Clayton Chastain, and I have been lucky enough to be one of the hosts of the Swine Nutrition Black Belt podcast for nearly 4 years now, and I'm also the research manager for Carthage Innovative Swine Solutions. And on behalf of the Wisenetics team, I would like to thank everyone who joined us today. This will certainly be an afternoon full of knowledge and valuable experiences, and we are very happy to have you here with us. I'm speaking from Bushnell, Illinois, or as I like to say, the middle of nowhere, Illinois, but I'm sure we have people from all over the country joining us. So feel free to share where you are right now. Feel free to post in the chat, and we would love to know. I would also like to thank our sponsors who made this event possible: Adiseo, Anatox, Eastman, and Essential Ag Solutions. And last but not least, a special thanks to our speakers who will have a lot of expertise and knowledge to bring to the event, and I'm sure it will add a lot to everyone listening. Feel free to also use the YouTube chat if you need help or have any questions. Everything will be answered at the end of each presentation. So without further ado, let's get started. I would like to introduce our first guest of the day, Dr. Benoit St. Pierre from South Dakota State University, who will discuss a microbiome perspective of gut health in swine. Dr. St. Pierre, welcome. It's been a pleasure to have you with us today.
Well, thank you very much for the introduction. It's a pleasure to be here, and thank you for the opportunity to speak at this summit. All right. As Clayton mentioned, I'm at South Dakota State University. By training, I'm a molecular biologist, which means that I'm kind of an oddball in an animal science department. But what all organisms have in common is they have DNA, and then DNA codes for enzymes. And then if you're able to do that, then you can adjust to just about anything. So I've been in microbiome since about 2011, and it's been a really good fit for me. So what I have in store for you today is to talk about microbiome. So before we can tie that into feed additives, we need to agree on what a microbiome is and how it works. So we'll spend a little bit of time on that. And then after that, I'll share some of my research that's related to the topic of microbiome and feed additives. So just as an aside, I mentioned I'm not an animal scientist, and I am an opportunist. So I've had the opportunity to take advantage of colleagues who work in a lot of different areas with a lot of different host species. So swine has been really good. We have a lot of swine nutritionists in the department. So I've been able to get samples from different studies and be able to put a story together on the microbiome and how it develops in pigs. And these are some of the papers that I'll be introducing later on during the talk. All right, so just to get started, let's all agree on what microbiomes are and how they work. There are different definitions out there, so I'll give you mine. So microbiome is a community of microbial species. So all of these species are adapted to specific microhabitat. So in the case that we're interested in would be the swine gut. But there are microbiomes on every surface that's exposed to the outside environment. So there are microbiomes on the surface of the skin, there are microbiome in the lungs. But the gut is really special because it has the highest number of species and also the highest density of cells. And the reason for this is just availability of substrates. So I mentioned that microbiomes is a group, or microbiome is a group of different species, and microorganisms tend to be specialists, and their design is to proliferate. So we tend to think of microorganisms proliferating as a bad thing, so like pathogens, for example. But even if you're a good bacteria, you are programmed to make copies of yourself. So if you want to make copies of yourself, you have some basic needs, and these are the source of energy. So you need to take chemicals or substrates or compounds and turn them into ATP, which is a currency that the cells use. And then you also need, if you want to make copies of yourself, you also need substrates. You need to be able to make compounds to duplicate yourself. So just as an example, this is a pathway of glucose utilization, and I use glucose as an example because it's probably the most widely used substrate in the gut. So as you can see in green, from glucose you can get ATP, so that's the energy that the cell or the bacterial cell can use, and that is going to be done through glycolysis. After metabolizing glucose, you get to pyruvate, and then from pyruvate, that can be used for anabolic pathways, so essentially make compounds so that cells can make copies of themselves. But they also produce what I like to refer to as trash or end products. So this would be acetate or lactate. So these are compounds that this particular cell is not going to be able to use. So from glucose, making acetate and lactate is a very common feature in a lot of gut microorganisms. So where does being specialized come from? Well, it comes from what source of glucose are you going to use? So if you compare starch and cellulose, for example, they're both made of glucose. So glucose here is represented by a purple hexagon. So in the case of starch, you have what's called an alpha bond. So if you look at the diagram at the bottom, you see that there's the CH2OH group at the top. So all the glucose are all aligned the same way, where that um, that group is all at the top. And if you look at cellulose, it's a different kind of bond. It's a beta bond. And you see that there's the CH2OH is going to alternate from top to bottom. So why is that a big deal? Well, that small difference, even though they're both made of glucose, means that you need different enzymes to be able to release glucose. So in the context of a specialist, so here's a diagram of a bacterial cell. Um, as you can see, I was born to be a biologist and not an artist. So the two rectangles represent the cell membrane and the cell wall of a bacterial cell. So in other words, in order for compounds to go in, they need to have a transporter. So that is represented here by a rectangle with an arrow. And then the little diagram to the left of it with kind of a scissor-like shape is meant to be the enzyme that's going to cut the cellulose or the starch to release glucose. Well, if you have a starch utilizer, it's going to have alpha amylase at its surface and not a cellulase. So if you give it cellulose, it's not going to be able to release glucose, so it's not going to be able to grow. So if you want to make your starch utilizer happy, then in that case, you provide it with starch. So then starch is going to be able to be cleaved by alpha amylase to release glucose, and then glucose can be transported into the cell and then metabolized into lactate and acetate. So in this particular case, with this metabolic specialist, if you give it starch, it's able to grow and be happy. But if you give it cellulose or anything else other than starch, then it wouldn't be able to proliferate. So why are microorganisms specialists? Well, it's because of their size. They are small, and that limits the size of their genome. So there's only so many enzymes that they can code in their genome. So you can compare it to a cell phone, for example. You can put a lot of apps on a cell phone, but you can't put all apps. You have to choose. So it's very similar to what a bacterial cell will be. It has to be a specialist. So as a consequence of being specialized, is you can't get all the goodies that you need to grow, and you need to have neighbors that provide you with these substrates. So there's a concept of cross feeding. So I put the starch utilizer at the top, so it's cleaving starch to release glucose and then produce lactate and acetate. And there's going to be other bacteria in the gut environment in this case. They're going to use lactate and make propionate. So when you combine them together, they benefit from being together. So one will cleave starch into lactate or process starch into lactate, and then lactate can be transformed into propionate, and then both of these can be used by the host. Okay, So if you amplify this by, let's say, hundreds or thousands with the number of species in the gut, you get very complex interactions between organisms. And what I like to call the microbial ecology mantra is that one species trashes another substrate. So in other words, if you release an end product, there's bound to be another species that's going to be able to use it. And so microbial ecology would be the sum of all these different relationships. So in this other diagram, we start with cellulose, and then we have green bacteria that are going to produce acetate and then hydrogen gas. The acetate can be absorbed by the host, or it can be used by other organisms that will make butyrate, which is another short chain fatty acid that can be used by the host. And then the hydrogen gas can be metabolized by methanogens to produce methane. So in this very simplified diagram, you can see that you have three different types of specialists that all benefit from being together as they complement each other with different functions. All right, so then what is a healthy microbiome? That's always a difficult one to answer. So some very basic elements for you. So to me, a healthy microbiome, it consists of microorganisms that are going to eat or digest or metabolize things that the host is unable to metabolize. So for example, cellulose or hemicellulose. If you have a lot of starch that is undigested, but that could be used by the host, then that could lead to proliferation of organisms that may not be beneficial that much. Another aspect is a healthy microbiome will have microorganisms that are going to produce nutrients for the host. So in this case, it would be short chain fatty acids. They're probably the most prominent ones. So acetate, propionate, and butyrate. And then they'll also produce vitamins. Vitamin B12, for example, is produced by microorganisms. And the other aspect of a healthy microbiome is you need to have what I put here as redundant cross-feeding relationships. So in other words, you need to have a lot of species that interact as subgroups, and then that leads to more stability in your system. And that's to prevent a condition that is called dysbiosis. So dysbiosis, you can define it as it's a change in the composition of the community that we can refer to as unstable. And it's typically caused by a disruption in the system. So you could have a change, a complete change in diet composition. You could have inflammation that introduces reactive oxygen species. So these different types of conditions are going to lead to dysbiosis, so a change in the community composition. And what that leads to is an opportunity for pathogens to establish themselves. So dysbiosis is a transient state. You can go to dysbiosis and back to a normal state, but if it stays for too long, then that's when you can have pathogens that will proliferate. And in terms of the swine production cycle, weaning is probably I didn't know which adjective to put there. Common, biggest, most troublesome cause of dysbiosis in the gut. All right, so then how do we promote a healthy microbiome in young pigs? Well, like I said, weaning is probably the biggest problem because you have a complete change in diet. So you go from liquid to solid, you go from animal compounds and milk to plant compounds. So you're completely changing the type of substrates that are available to microorganisms, which means that you're going to have a complete turnover. There are also stress that's involved from social interactions, transportation. You can also have inflammation. So these are going to change conditions in the gut. And as a result of these changes, then the composition of the microbiome is going to be prone to change, prone to instability. And the other aspect too is that because the animal is also adjusting to the change in diet, there are going to be a lot of nutrients that are going to be available for microorganisms to use that may not be optimal. Okay. So this leads to another concept, which is microbial succession. And all of these terms, microbial ecology and microbial succession, they're borrowed from macroecology. We use the same terms. So at the in the graph at the bottom, I put nursing, nursery, and growing finishing as the main disruptions or the main changes during the cycle in terms of microbiome. So during nursing, you have a certain type of community that's represented in green, and they're the most abundant. And then at the end of nursery, end of nursing, transition to nursery, you have weaning, and then that introduces another type of community that's and then finally towards the end of nursery, then that's when you get a more stable community that's being established. So how does that translate to in terms of um, actual species? Well, as part of my collaborations with swine nutritionists in the department, we've had a few studies, mostly in nursery, at the nursery stage, some of them, or one of them at the grower finishing stage. And there's some interesting, I guess, themes that come out from combining these studies together. And one of them is what the composition is in a mature pig. So typical representation or perception that we have of microbiome is, lactobacillus, you may have heard the term, is those are the best, um, um, those are the most, what do you say? They're seen as the most beneficial, but in mature pigs, we don't see lactobacillus at all. And these are new species that we have identified. So here I've put, they're labeled as SSDs. We give them codes instead of species names because we've identified them by DNA, so we can't assign it to species. So you see here that the 7 that are represented here or shown here, they're, they represent the most abundant. If you compare their abundance, so mature stage would be on the right side, and then the nursery stage would be on the left side. You can see that the abundance really dramatically is really low in what I call an immature microbiome during the nursery stage and compared to the mature stage. So one of the things that we can possibly do is or develop strategies to get them to be at that mature stage a lot faster. Okay, so then how do we, well, we need to be able to determine um, what do these species do, and then it turns out that they're all unknown species. So what I represented here are the closest valid taxa. So these are their closest neighbor to compare to. And then the percentage that I put in parentheses is how similar they are. So the closer they are to 100%, then the more likely you are to make good predictions as to what they do. So you can see that only 2 out of the 7 are actually matched to known species, and the other ones are completely unknown, which means that how can we how can we get to this stage? So then this is where feed additives could come into play. We could move the mature state, or we can induce the mature state a little earlier if we know what these most abundant or species that are mature microbiomes like to eat. Okay. And then I had one question one slide for questions, but I see that there's a question already. So the first question is, what can we do to reduce the risk of dysbiosis? Well, maintaining a stable diet is probably the best way. Minimizing stress is also a good strategy. And again, these are all, again, from a poor microbial ecology um, perspective, these are things that are really hard to do during weaning. So I guess in terms of, um, I guess at weaning, instead of reducing the risk of dysbiosis, it would be how to induce a smoother transition to a mature state, if that helps.
Awesome. Thank you very much, Dr. St. Pierre. Yes, I'll go ahead and ask the question for myself just based on that. So you mentioned weaning and how weaning is going to be one of, and it's unavoidable. It's going to be one of the higher stress situations within a pig's life, and some sort of dysbiosis is going to occur there. For the average farmer in the United States, at least, what technologies or practices are available to us to try to reduce the potential amount of stress and gut dysbiosis that can occur at that time?
Well, I'll admit that this is a bit outside of my comfort zone, but I think creep feed is probably a good way to go because you want, yeah, I think diet is probably the major change. As much as stress and inflammation will have an effect, it's a change in diet that is the most likely cause of dysbiosis during that stage. So I think currently there are limits to what a producer can do. But what I'm hoping the type of research we're doing is that we can identify, or actually we've identified, what are major bacteria in the mature microbiome of a pig. So how do we get there as fast as possible? So this could be by adding prebiotics. So again, if we know what the good bacteria like to eat, then we can put that a little extra pixie dust in the diet to help the good bacteria to grow faster, basically.
Gotcha. And we have another question from the audience here. What do you think really matters, slash, what are the key considerations when it comes to designing diets to help pigs build a more stable gut microbiome?
I I would say fiber would in terms of feed ingredients, and then try to um, maintain the same type of fiber throughout the different stages. But again, before I can give you a more definite answer, we need to know what these particular bacterial groups like to eat. And then we're still in the process of doing that. I have a PhD student who's on the case. So hopefully, maybe within the next 5 years, we'll be able to give you better answers.
Gotcha.
It's
And
a
then
long
from,
timeline because we're a little slow.
yeah. And other question following up on that, you mentioned fiber. Are there specific types of fiber? I mean, I know you said that we're trying to figure out what they eat and what those bacteria really need, but in terms of the type of fibers available, should we be targeting more insoluble fibers, more soluble fibers, or if there's any that you know that are currently on the swine market and are commonly available to producers, is there certain fibers that you would recommend?
Well, so far, in terms of bacterial metabolism, cellulose is really the main one that we've identified. Some hemicellulose, but in terms of soluble fiber, we haven't come across species yet that are able to metabolize them. Now, it doesn't mean that they're not there, but they might be in lower abundance.
Gotcha. Is there any more questions from the audience or anything that we would discuss? If not, then we'll go ahead and move on to the next speaker. Doesn't look like it. So thank you, Dr. St. Pierre, for sharing all this with us. I appreciate it. Awesome. So before we take a break, we'll go ahead and move on to our next guest, Dr. Marta Bruguera Bonfil from Essential Ag Solutions. Today, she will talk about managing mycotoxin challenges in swine. Dr. Bonfil, welcome. The floor is yours.
Hello, and thank you very much for the introduction and for the nice opportunity to be here. I'm a licensed veterinarian, and I'm the Global Technical Lead Swine at Royal Agri-Firm Group, the parent company of Special Nutrients, a company specializing mycotoxin binders for over 30 years, and the partner in the US with Essential Ag for over 10 years already. So today we are going to discuss a little bit about mycotoxins and their impact on the swine industry. And we can say that mycotoxins are no longer just a feed quality issue. They are not just a feed contaminant, but they are actually a profitable and swine health issue that affect both the bottom line and the health status of your swine operation. So normally in nature, we see that mycotoxin contamination occurs with 2 or more mycotoxins at the same time. Minimum 2, many times 3 or 4. This is because the same fungi produce more than one mycotoxin. So if the fungi is present and it's producing mycotoxins, it will produce more than one kind. In nature, then, the normal situation is that you have low levels of several mycotoxins at the same time, or in some cases, a high contamination by one of the mycotoxins with low levels of some of the others. And mycotoxins have a synergistic effect, so they help each other to create damage. And also they have a cumulative effect. So even cases of low contamination by several mycotoxins, it will affect production. So we are going to focus on 3 of the main mycotoxins affecting swine. There are many others, but these 3 that you can see in the slide maybe are the most important, affecting both the health and the performance in the swine operations. So first, it's very important to know that the first effect of mycotoxin contamination is immune suppression. So even at low contamination levels, you will always have an immune suppression. And for example, at field level, when you don't get the expected titers from a vaccination program, one of the several things that you should check is for potential mycotoxin contamination, which can create an immune suppression effect, and consequently, the vaccines are not working as we would like. Sorry. And here, as you can see, also each mycotoxin on top of it have that we call a target organ. And a target organ is the most affected organ when we have a high contamination of a specific or a particular mycotoxin. So here you can visually see where the damage happens for each mycotoxin. And also you can see the reference levels when we can expect some signs in the field. So for example, for zearalenone, the target organ is the reproductive system. Why? It's because zearalenone has a very clear estrogenic effect, because the zearalenone molecule and the estrogen molecules are quite similar. So, and in case of fumonisin contamination, the most characteristic symptom is the pulmonary edema. And the most important symptom in case of vomitoxin contamination is feed refusal. And as a consequence, of course, you will have lower performance parameters. And there are also a lot of other symptoms for all mycotoxins that are related to the immune suppression, coming even from low contamination levels and possible secondary infections. And now we are going to talk a little bit individually about each mycotoxin. Vomitoxin, as we said before, the main symptom is feed refusal. And we can see also vomits and diarrhea, mainly in nursery piglets, which as the most sensitive, especially after the weaning time. But with high contamination levels, we can also see vomits and diarrhea in sows or in fatteners. So the intestinal mucosa is the body's first line of defense, and it's working as a barrier that protects against the free passage of intestinal contents. So vomitoxin damages the intestinal mucosa, increasing its permeability and allowing the free passage of other pathogenic agents, such as endotoxins, bacterial toxins, for example, from the intestinal lumen into the bloodstream, and favoring the inflammatory effects of LPS and others. And vomitoxin, as you can see in the photo, also affects liver. And in this case, it produces a reduction in the liver size. For fumonisin, the toxicity comes from the alteration of the sphingolipids metabolism. So actually, there is a good biomarker of fumo contamination, which is the sphinganin to sphingosine ratio in serum, and the value of the ratio increases in case of fumo contamination, indicating cellular stress and toxicity. So, like we said before, the most characteristic symptom in case of high fumo contamination, we will see pulmonary edema. And there is also an enlargement of the heart. And some people question if it came secondarily from the lung affection or in the other way around. But normally, at field level, when we have high contaminations, we see both signs. So, and also liver can be affected. And in this case, we usually see an increase of the size. And other symptoms that we can see are as the consequence of the immune suppression and the interaction with other toxins or other pathogenic agents. And fumonisin compromises the immune and the respiratory system. And its interaction with other pathogens, such as Pasteurella multocida, Mycoplasma pneumonia, PIRS, can lead to aggravated pneumonia for sure and lung damage. And fumo also damages, as vomitoxin, the intestinal barrier integrity and contributes also to dysbiosis within the gut microbiome. As we said before, zearalenone has an hyperestrogenic effect. So besides all the effects that we can see with high contaminations in sows, such as in vitro mortality, prolonged estrus intervals, infertility, and also we can see mainly in the gills, rectal, vaginal, or uterine prolapses, neonates, piglets, are also susceptible to the effects of ZEA, both in utero and through the sow milk, and results in a low viability of the piglets and an increase of piglets with splylect and vulvovaginitis. So with vulvovaginitis, we can see it's very typical, and we can see it with really low levels of ZEA. And also boars are affected, and we can see preputial swelling, enlargement of the mammary glands, and with high contaminations, we can see also a decrease in the spermatogenesis, the libido, testicular weight, and testosterone levels also. So far, we have been talking about the problem, potential mycotoxicosis, and now we can discuss about the solution. So we said before that natural mycotoxin contamination normally involves 2, 3, or more mycotoxins. So any solution would have to take care of different mycotoxins at once. Our product, Protectate Plus, has a wide spectrum range of toxin binding. So it's a clay-based product, and the original raw ingredient, the selected natural clay, undergoes 2 industrial processes: purification first, and then an activation process. And it results in a change of the polarity of the surface area, so the contact area between the binder and the mycotoxin, and also an increased space between the layers in the binder molecule. So the binder molecule has a layer structure, and the layers are further separated, allowing mycotoxins to enter. So this results in an excellent binding capacity across a different range of toxin polarities and size, and across a different range of gastrointestinal pH, providing a broad spectrum protection. And this binding capacity, for sure, has been scientifically tested, both in vitro and also in vivo. And if you want, we can see together some of the results. So here is where the data speaks for itself. Two benchmark in vitro tests and Protectate Plus outperform competitive products, binding significantly higher levels of fumonisin and zearalenone in this case. And this is an independent study by the Ghent University in Belgium. It's one of the reference universities in Europe for mycotoxin studies. And they have collected several commercial products and tested them for the in vitro binding capacity against zearalenone at different pHs. As you can see in the test, they tested pH 2.5, 6.5, and 8. In vitro tests should be performed at different pH levels, acidic and basic. And the reason is to mimic the natural change of pH in the gastrointestinal tract. So ideally, a good binder captures the mycotoxin at low pH in the stomach and maintains it bound through the intestine and through the change of pH to more basic, avoiding its absorption until the excretion in the feces. So for this test, the ideal results will be a product binding ZEA at 3 different pHs and showing that it potentially will work through the different pH of the gastrointestinal tract. As you can see in the slide in the right part, AC, activate charcoal, in the chart, it was used as the reference to test the binding capacity of the different products. And Protectate Plus was number 6, so you can see that it bound ZEA completely, so 100% binding at 3 different pHs. So it was one of the top products in this case. And in vitro trials don't tell you the whole story. So they are relatively good indication of binding capacity, but not ideal. So as we mentioned before, we need to test the product in real animals, in vivo. So this trial was performed placing in the stomach of live piglets a single bolus of feed contaminated with zearalenone with or without the binder. So as you can see, the yellow group without binder and the blue group with the binder. So the metabolite Zen-glucuronide in blood was then tested as a marker at different time points following the bolus administration of ZEA to measure the ZEA absorption. And as you can see, animals that did not receive the binder in yellow color had an initial a higher initial Zen-glucuronide peak in blood, showing the initial absorption and then a gradual decrease as metabolization takes place. In the other hand, animals receiving the bolus of feed with ZEA plus the binder had a much lower initial peak, indicating a much lower initial absorption of ZEA. So these results prove that the binder is capable of stopping the absorption of zearalenone in the stomach and in the intestine. And so far, we have shown results in vitro and in vivo in the lab. But now we can show you results of feeding trials, the ones that, of course, will relate better to the efficacy of the product in the farm. And the way we normally perform these trials is as follows. We make 3 different treatments, negative control, no mycotoxin, no binder, mycotoxin group with a very high mycotoxin contamination because we want to generate the toxic effect, and we don't use binder in this case, and the binder group with the same very high mycotoxin contamination and the binder at the recommended dose to see if the binder can stop the mycotoxin action. So, and for results, we look at performance parameters. We look at average daily gain, feed intake, feed conversion rate, but they don't prove the efficacy of the product because you can get good results, for example, using an antibiotic or a growth promoter. So to prove that the product is working directly against the mycotoxin, you have to see statistical differences in the biomarker or target organ lesions, which are the direct effect of the mycotoxin toxicity. Here in the slide, you have 2 in vivo trials, both using 25 ppm of fumo, which is a very high dose. Remember that the reference value is 5 ppm. And the recommended dose of Protectate Plus, which was 2 pounds per ton. So in both cases, performance parameters were affected in the mycotoxin group, as you can see. And in the binder group, performed same as the control group. In the first trial, in the left, we checked target organs, lungs, you can see the photos below, lungs, heart, and liver. So all 3 organs are bigger in size in the mycotoxin group, and in the binder group, the size is the same as in the control group, proving that the product prevents the action of fumonisin. And in the second trial, in the right part, we check the biomarker sphinganin to sphingosine ratio. So the mycotoxin group, as you can see, has a value for the ratio which is double than the control group. And Protectate Plus group value is statistically the same as the control. Again, indicating that Protectate Plus is capable of stopping the toxic action of fumonisin. Here we have another trial. This one is for zearalenone. So the target organ will be the reproductive system. In this case, the contamination, it was also very high, 750 ppb of ZEA. And remember that the recommended levels are less than 100 ppb. So, and here, there are no difference in production parameters, but it's not surprising since zearalenone normally will cause the main effects on the reproductive system. But we check the target organs and we saw an increase in ovaries, uterus, cervix, and total reproductive tract in the mycotoxin group compared with the control group. And in this case, Protectate Plus group has a bit higher than the control group, but still the values were much smaller than the mycotoxin group. Again, proving the action of Protectate Plus against zearalenone in this case. And here we have another in vivo trial with a combination. We have high contamination with ZEA, 1.2 ppm, and 6 ppm of vomitoxin, both extremely high levels. So this combination in nature, it's quite normal since the same fungi can produce both mycotoxins. So in this case, as you can see, feed intake and consequently weight gain were affected because of DON toxicity. And as you can see in the right part of the slide, the liver weight, we talk already that vomitoxin produce a decrease in the liver size. So as you can see here, the mycotoxin group had a statistically smaller size of the liver than the control group. And the group with Protectate Plus has almost same liver size as control group. And for ZEA, again, we check reproductive parameters. And here you can see below in the slide, in this case, we check the size of the vulva over time. And as you can see here in the graph, the mycotoxin group keeps increasing the size of the vulva over time, while the control and Protectate Plus group remain stable over time. So as the total reproductive tract, you can see in the upper part of the photo, the mycotoxin group doubled the size of the control group, while Protected Plus significantly reduced the action of ZIA, here proving that the product is working against the combination of vomitoxin and zearalenone in gills. And scientific trials are a must to prove that the product actually works and the mode of action. And we have shown you some examples of in vitro and also in vivo trials, but we have many more studies with also other mycotoxins and with also other animal species, poultry, dairy, and consistently proving the efficacy of the product in a scientific way. And this is actually what differentiates Protected Plus from our competitors, the amount of scientifically published data. So, of course, field experience is also very important, and we consistently get reports of Protect A Plus working under field conditions. For example, as cases of 20 ppm of FUMO contamination that were solved with an inclusion rate of 2 pounds of Protected Plus per ton of feed a couple months ago. In summary, we can say that Protected Plus works with an excellent binding capacity against a broad spectrum of mycotoxins scientifically tested in vitro and also in vivo. And thank you very much again for your time and attention, and I will be glad to answer any questions that you may have. Thanks a lot, sincerely.
Thank you, Marta. I appreciate everything you gave us in that presentation. Just looking at a couple comments that I see several questions here. I'll start with the first one. One question was, if the product worked as well as activated charcoal in the study, is there a concern for vitamin and mineral binding as well?
We have performed also a lot of trials to ensure that the product is not binding any vitamin or any nutritional. So we have all the documentation. So if somebody have interest, we can also send the reports on that, and for sure. And in the other way around, we also check productive parameters to see that the inclusion of the product is not decreasing the productive parameters.
Awesome. Another question I see is Gloria asks, do you find differences of incidence depending on the country, continent, or the contamination, or are the contamination levels similar everywhere?
It depends on the country, but really last years, it seems that there is a big increase on the detection levels of mycotoxins. Maybe it's due to the climate change, and we have more really warm periods, and then really wet periods with a lot of rain. And in some regions where, for example, in the past, we usually don't see so much levels of fumonisin contamination. Now we are finding some really high levels, and also with clinical signs in the animals. So, but it depends really a lot, because at the end it depends on the fungi. It's growing in the field. And then it depends on the storage also, because some fungi can still continue growing during the storage. It depends also in the different factories, how they manage all the raw materials. But the tendency is to see every time more different mycotoxins and higher levels, unfortunately.
Gotcha. And then Isabelle asks, in your experience, what's the best way to keep an eye on mycotoxins? When do you think it's the right time to take action?
In my point of view, sometimes it's quite difficult to say, okay, this is a mycotoxin problem, because it depends on the age of the animal, they are more or less sensitive. And also, we know that we have always several mycotoxins at the same time. So the clinical signs, so they can appear. You can have an acute outbreak of clinical signs. I don't know. For example, with FUMO, with pulmonary edema, but a lot of cases you have a chronic problems, or you have only immunosuppression and you have other pathogens, other things. So for me, it's key prevention, working at field level, at factory level, preventing molds, and in feed prevention, especially with young animals, so piglets, which are the most sensitive, and sows, because only due its impact on the immunity, and then fatteners is another thing, no? For me, fatteners, if you see some clinical signs, or then you can make an evaluation and say, okay, now it makes sense to use binder product because in this moment I have this problem. But for me, prevention and also monitoring, making analysis to know the quality of your raw materials, it's quite important also. But protection of and prevention on sows and piglets are key.
Gotcha. And then Jeff asks, is it working more on zearalenone or fumonisin or DON due to their polarity differences in molecular size? Are there additional ways to enhance the efficacy of binders, like with enzymatic detoxification?
So in this case, with our product, we are working with the different polarities and different size. So as you can see, for example, for FUMO, it's a huge molecule. So it's for that reason that for sure, natural clay cannot bind polar hydrophobic and hydrophilic molecules at the same time. So after the specific treatments that we make, we can enhance different polarities, and due to the more space that we give between layers in the structure, for example, FUMO, which is one of the biggest, can go in. And for sure, other companies are using other kinds of, for example, enzymatic detoxification or other systems to tackle different kinds of mycotoxins.
And the last question I have, Rogerio asks about the effects of pelleting. So in terms of mash feed versus pellet feed, is there different levels of mycotoxin due to the heat required to produce the pellets? And does it also affect the efficacy of the binder?
The problem of the mycotoxins is that they are resistant to the temperature. So it doesn't matter if we pellet the feed, the mycotoxins are there. So this is the main problem. And also they are resistant to a lot of chemical treatments. So that's the main problem. And the other thing, it's we pellet feed, for example, in case of our product, it's a natural modified clay. So it's not affected by the temperature when you pelleting. We also, if you have interest, we can send you the reports, because we have a lot of analysis with different pelleting temperatures to see that the product is still working after high temperatures exposure. So in this case, no problem with this kind of molecule.
Gotcha. Well, I believe that's all the questions we have. So thank you again, Marta, for that awesome presentation.
Thanks to you. Thank you.
So now we will have a 10-minute break. Please take this opportunity to stretch your legs, go to the bathroom, have some water, or grab a cup of coffee. We'll be back soon. Oh, before we go, however, I would like to thank our sponsors, Adiseo, Anatox, Eastman, and Essential Ag Solutions. See you in a few minutes.
Just like the street lights lit this town, like a fire in a blaze, gotta burn it down. Can't be afraid to leave this out. We got this far, don't know how. I see danger in our eyes. They know we'll burn down the night. Coming just like the sunrise. You know that we're gonna let it rain. Tonight, we're gonna let it rain. Tonight, we're gonna let it rain. Just like the sunrise, we're gonna let it rain.
Where knowledge comes alive, bringing ideas that make you thrive. From the experts to the field, we bridge the gap, connecting minds with every word and every chat. We're the pulse of progress, the voice of the wise, sharing insights, sparking minds, opening eyes. From research to practice, we break it down, turning complexity into knowledge renowned. Get smarter, get sharper with every listen. Ideas that grow, perspectives that glisten. From the lab to the farm, we're making waves. WiseNet, it's where the future is paved. We're more than just stories, we're learning in action, helping you stay ahead with every interaction. From the ground up, we build the flow. WiseNet, it's the place where knowledge grows. From the lab to the farm, we're making waves. WiseNet, it's where the future is paved.
Hello again and welcome back, everyone. Before we get started, I would like to thank our sponsors one more time, Adiseo, Anatox, Eastman, and Essential Ag Solutions. So if you're just now joining us, I'm Clayton Chastain, and I'm your host this afternoon. I hope you enjoyed the break and took the chance to recharge your battery, because here we go again. Let's continue with our presentations and move on to our next speaker. Please remember that at the end of each presentation, we will have a Q&A session, so feel free to post any questions you may have in the chat during the presentation. So next, I would like to welcome Dr. Darlene Bloxham from Adiseo to talk about nutrition that's built for resilience. Welcome, Dr. Bloxham.
Welcome. Thank you, Clayton, for that introduction and the opportunity to be here. And let's talk about what nutrition for resilience means and why focusing on nutrition is part of the answer. So optimized nutrition is key for growth, reproduction, and immunity. And for this talk, we are going to be focusing on the immunity aspect. Immunity is needed in a system to optimize health and growth and ultimately profitability of any system. There are many factors that impact the animal's immune status, from weaning and travel stress to health status and production phase. And nutrition is a key factor throughout a pig's life that impacts immunity. And there are actually a few molecules that can affect a pig's immune response. And today I'm going to be talking about one of those molecules, glycerol monolaurate. And just a little bit about this molecule, because it has a couple different names, is glycerol monolaurate, or uh, GML, sometimes also referred to as alpha monolaurin, which is this molecule here. There's a glycerol with a 12 chain length fatty acid, and that's also called lauric acid as well, just to understand the nomenclature of this talk. And GML has some clear advantages over the free fatty acid, lauric acid. Uh, GML is more stable across a wide ranges of pHs than lauric acid. So the top graph shows lauric acid, and there's a dissociation of that hydrogen from one form to another between pHs 4 and 6. And this occurs during a normal physiological pH found in the swine gastrointestinal tract. And the bottom figure here is alpha monolaurin, and you can see that this is a very stable molecule, and it doesn't start, and there's no dissociation until very high pHs of 12 and above. So GML is a very stable molecule in the gastrointestinal tract and is not affected by changing pHs in the gastrointestinal tract. And that's very similar for all monoglycerides compared to their comparative organic acid. And GML can also interact with gram-positive bacteria and the cell membrane to break down the cell wall. So what happens here is that you have an increase in permeability, and this can alter the membrane because this GML molecule can work into the membrane of these gram-positive bacteria, increasing permeability and overall impacting that bacteria's ability to perform cellular functions and replicate, and ultimately causing cell lysis. GML can also interact with envelope viruses to reduce viral activity, seen here. So Jackman et al. Has shown that GML was able to inhibit African swine fever virus more than lauric acid. And GML can also interact with other types of viruses as well, and having inhibitory properties against them, against porcine reproductive and respiratory syndrome, otherwise known as PRRS. And that's shown here in this trial conducted by Adiseo, where there was an in vitro trial looking at the ability for glycerides of C12, again, focusing on the monoglycerides of lauric acid to inhibit and have an immune effect during a PRRS infection. So this was an in vitro trial where they took porcine alveolar macrophages from 4-week-old pigs and cultured them with PRRS and these glycerides C12 in different ways to assess the titer values of PRRS and also look at the cytokine analysis and different immune markers as well. And there were 3 different infection assays. So there was co-incubation, where that was to look for any sort of direct antiviral activity. So that was essentially the GML or the glycerides of C12 with the PRRS inoculation at the same time. Then there was another assay looking at pre and post-infection with glycerides of C12 to look at a protective effect. And then there was a post-infection assay to see if there was any indirect antiviral effect of these glycerides of C12. And looking at the results of this trial, treatment 1 had lower titer values from hours 1 through 6 hours post-infection, but at 24 hours, all treatments were the same, had same titer values to some short incubation time between the molecule itself and the PRRS virus. And then while we're looking at the next results of the pre and post infection, we can see that we have lower viral titers from hours 6 through 12 for treatment 2, and then at 24 hours for treatment 3 as well. And then for post infection, treatments 2 and 3 both had lower titer values. Looking at the immune response for the pre and post infection assay, there was higher TNF alpha for the pre and post infection assay for all treatments. And then for the post infection assay, there's higher TNF alpha for treatment 3. Also for the pre and post infection assay, there was higher interleukin 8 values statistically for treatments 2 and 3, and numerically for treatment 1. And then for the post-infection assay, there was higher interleukin 8 for treatments 2 and 3 as well. And none of the other interleukins that were tested were statistically significant. And then to summarize this trial, there's a summary of an abnormal immune response where we have pathogen invasion, and the macrophages are the first line of activation. We have the immune system activated, and then ultimately that is a good enough defense to control the pathogen invasion. During a PRRS infection, macrophages are not activated, the immune system is not activated, and then there is a massive viral infection. With this trial, we can see that there's a possible antiviral effect. There's an activation of the macrophages, and there is there's immune stimulation, and there's a viral clearance that's initiated, and this helps to control the virus. And this also helps so from this trial, we can conclude that there's a neutralization. There's a stimulation of the immune system, and this helps with the immune suppression that we typically see during a PRRS infection. And the next question comes about of how do we apply this to commercial situations? So this was a commercial trial ran at a commercial farm in Belgium, and had a history of PRRS and strep, and this was a batch farrowing system. So the first batch of pigs, or the May batch, was a control group with no glycerides of C12 supplementation. And then the June farrowing was the treatment group which was a glycerides C12 and the same product that was used in the previous trial, and it does have a commercial name called Frost C12. And how this trial was done is that this was the treatments were done in lactation, so the sows were fed this 1 day before lactation and throughout lactation. And if the sows were on the same treatment in lactation, those piglets had the same supplementation in the nursery as well. So the control group had no supplementation at all, no in the nursery or in lactation, but in the treatment group we had 3 kilograms per metric ton in lactation, and then in the wean pigs we had 4 kilograms a metric ton of Frost C12 in phase 1 and 3 kilograms per metric ton of Frost C12 in phase 2. And looking at the results for the sows, the supplementation of this product does seem to indicate that there is an increased number of pigs weaned and a decrease in pre-wean mortality. And looking at the nursery results, we can see that there's a decrease in the number of individual treatments due to locomotion problems, which is typically an indicator of strep treatments. And then at 37 days post-weaning, there is a decrease in the number of animals that test positive for PRRS, indicating that there's a quicker clean out of PRRS through those pigs as well. So in today's ever-changing swine production environment, there's a need for nutritional strategies that go beyond the basic requirements. By supporting immunity through science-based ingredients like glycerol monolaurate, we can help pigs better withstand everyday challenges from environmental stress to disease pressure. And this is more than just feed, it's nutrition built for resilience. It's how we at Adiseo empower producers to protect performance, safeguard health, and build a stronger future for their herds. Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you very much, Dr. Bloxham, for that wonderful presentation. So for questions, I'll start out with one from Isabelle. She asks, where do you think a monolaurin-based additive would have the biggest impact in the production cycle? Could it interfere with other products in the program, such as organic acids or vaccines?
As far as the biggest impact in the production cycle, our research indicates that lactation phase is definitely where they would have their biggest impact. As far as working with other ingredients, these products do work really well with other ingredients and are often fed in combination with other organic acids and even other shorter chain acids like citric acid and butyrate as well. So they do work well, and to my knowledge, they don't interfere with vaccines or anything like that.
Gotcha. And then when you also get to the weaning age, because those pigs are very immunosuppressed at that time, should you then continue adding that into the nursery diets as well?
Yes, that's what we would recommend, and that's also what this trial showed, is that there is an increased benefit because from that trial, those animals were on a PRRS positive farm, they wean PRRS positive, and just getting them through that challenge as well, because we know when we wean pigs that are PRRS positive, everything can kind of go well, and then they seem to sometimes crash. So sometimes helping those animals after they wean to support them through the health events that they may have inherited from the sow farm is also important as well.
Gotcha. And then last question from me, at least, is that when using this product, I mean, you've talked a lot about PRRS. PRRS is obviously one of probably the most impactful diseases currently within the market today. There's obviously other ones such as PED, which is a big thing, ASV, of course, which is in certain parts of the world. Have we tested this product in terms of the efficacy that it would work with other viruses such as PED?
I need to look back at my literature. I do want to say that there is one trial that was a PED PERS positive farm. That's one thing when we're looking about these, um, not just glycerol monolaurate as a whole, but when we're looking at these whole chain of acids, um, they do they do kind of all have their different chemical properties. Um, Not to say that glycerol monolaurate won't work with different um, virus conditions, but definitely it does seem like the literature would suggest that um, glycerol monolaurate would be the most impactful against PERS. And there may be some other strategies for different compounds like PED. Not to say that it won't work, but there might be some more impactful fatty acids in that or medium chain compounds that might be a little bit more helpful.
Awesome. Well, I believe that's all the questions we have. So thank you, Darlene, for coming on and sharing all this with us. And then last but not least, I would like to welcome Dr. Felipe Hickman from Laval University, who will talk about feeding strategies to mitigate the environmental impacts of pig production. Take it away, Dr. Hickman.
Thank you, Clay, for having me. And now we will changing a little bit the topic about sustainability. And I will be discussing some feeding strategies to mitigate the environmental impacts of pig production. Before I start, I would like to do some acknowledgements. I did a dual PhD program in Brazil and Canada under the direction of Marie-Pierre de Tourneau-Mini and Dr. Inês Andretta. And today I will be presenting some of our research projects that we have been developing in partnership over the last few years. I know this topic is not familiar for some of you, so I would like to start with a question. What do you consider as an environmental impact? I know when we are thinking about additives, we want to see the positive impact on animals. But when you think about environmental impact, what do you think it is? So it's any change, beneficial or adverse, in physical, chemical, or biological properties of the environment caused by a particular activity. We will be focused on mitigation strategies, but there are other positive impacts that are related with such activities. But what to consider when we are evaluating the environmental impacts? There is a growing demand to evaluate the climate change impact, so the CO2 emissions. But when we are thinking about pig production, there are other impacts, such as eutrophication, acidification, land use. So there are a lot of environmental impacts that we need to consider in our analysis. Usually when we are doing a life cycle assessment, we are considering at least climate change, eutrophication, and acidification when we are discussing pig production. But when we are discussing sustainability, we are discussing complex systems. So we need to consider different stages, different phases throughout the entire cycle. I know when we like some additives, this is the best thing in the world, but as attractive as it can be, we never should forget the big picture and all the complexities. So all the interactions between the performance and the environmental impacts. So that's why there is a well-established methodology to evaluate environmental impacts, as it's called life cycle assessment. It's a holistic view of impacts. Identification of critical points is a basis for decision making. So there is an increasing interest over the recent years, and we should be using this methodology when evaluating the environmental impacts. For such methodology, modeling is crucial. We need to know all the phases, we need to know all the impact categories that we'll be evaluating, and all the things that we are including in the model to evaluate. That's why the importance of animal malnutrition. We need to maximize feed efficiency because there is a direct relationship between environmental impact and performance. I would like to say that the amount of resource needed is related to a given output. If we need less resources needed, we can maximize the output. So this study is a very interesting study that did a relationship between performance and environmental impact. And we can see that there is a direct relationship between those two variables. And at least 90% of all the environmental impacts is related to performance. So it's very important to maximize the resources that we are using to maximize the output. Each ingredient that we are using in our feeds, there is an environmental impact associated with it. So for example, if we use the corn or soybean and other ingredients, there is an environmental impact associated with such ingredients. And there are different databases that they compile all those environmental impacts. They are intrinsic of each ingredient that is being used in feed formulation. And for the Brazilian audience, we may be familiar with this, but each ingredient also has different impacts depending on the region. So we need to consider also the ingredient, but also the region that is being produced and shipped. So we need to consider a lot of factors when doing such environmental impact assessment. And there are some different available software to do this. There are, like, for example, CIMA-Pro, OpenLCA, and some R or Python coding. So there are some advantages and disadvantages of using such softwares. Some are more expensive. There are some limited data, perhaps, or for some it's quite difficult to use the Python language, for example. So in this context, we did a systematic review to evaluate the environmental impacts of pig production. And we have found for climate change that more than 60% of the overall impact is associated with feed production. So feed is important, and we need to address that when trying to mitigate the environmental impacts of pig production. But it's far beyond feeding, because it's not about just giving the feed to the animals, but all the phases that are needed to produce those feeds. So we are all the corn, the soybean, all the ingredients that are being produced, all the transportation to produce that feed that's being fed to the animals. So feed is important, and we need to address those environmental impacts. But if you see, there is a great variability among studies. So there are different nutritional strategies that we can be using to address in different contexts, in different scenarios. And we may also consider other impact categories. For example, if you are studying eutrophication or acidification, we may consider the impact of manure management. That's the impact is huge in those impacts. So that's why there are different nutritional strategies that we can use to address those environmental impacts. Today, I will be discussing some of them that can be used to address the environmental impact association, especially those associated with enzymes and amino acids that are being supplemented. So let's start with the elephant in the room, the phytase. Phytase is used a lot. So what do you consider as the environmental impact associated with phytase? Do you think that phytase affect the performance of the animals? Yes or no? What do you think? Because many of you may, well, phytase is good. There is an improvement in performance, but calm down. Usually those impacts, they're associated with the NPP requirements. So if you are getting closer to the NPP requirements, you are seeing a less impact of phytase. So from an environmental point of view, we are reducing the amount of inorganic phosphorus that is limited, and we are also reducing the phosphorus excretion. It's not so much the impact of performance, because we can supplement with other phosphorus inorganic sources. So we need to consider all those things when running those life cycle assessment studies. We did a systematic review that was published this year, and only 4 studies perform life cycle assessments for phytase in pig production. There is a shortage of studies in this area, And there are a lot of variability between those studies. Some evaluate with different functional units, different scopes, and they found different outcomes. But usually they found difference between regions. If I'm producing in like a deforested region, or if I reducing a lot of phosphorus question. So each of the studies, they found different results, but overall there are some positive impacts associated with phytase. Well, if phytase, that's very well known in the feed industry, what about other enzymes? So we were the first group to do a life cycle assessment with beta-manganase. So to do a life cycle assessment for beta-manganase, we need to consider all the performance on animals, but also all the other phases that are associated with pig production itself. So for this study, we evaluate what are the benefits of using beta-mannans and beta-mannanase. So beta-mannans, they are present in a great variety of ingredients, especially soybean meal, and they start an inflammatory process. So the animals, they waste some energy to fight those pumps that develop, and they waste some energy for that. Instead of using that energy, we can put those energies for performance. So as nutritionists, when we are doing some feed formulation, we can use different energy matrix. So instead of using some energy that otherwise would be using to fight the inflammatory process, we can put for performance. We perform some meta-analysis on the subject. We found some improvements in weight gain, feed conversion, and some improvement also in the digestibility of this dry matter, crude protein, and energy. So overall, when we are talking about beta-mannanase, we are seeing an improvement in gut health because the animal doesn't need to fight against the inflammatory process. So it can reserve the energy for performance. So when doing those feed formulation and doing those life cycle assessment, we formulate different feeds for each of those phases. For example, for the nursery phase, we divided pre-starter, starter phase, complex, simple diets, control without beta-mannanase or with beta-mannanase. We did this for the nursery, for the growing feeding phase, and for the finish phase. And for all those phases, we saw a similar pattern. We are reducing the amount of oil, soybean oil that is being used because we allocate those energy in the matrix, so we don't need to use that much soybean oil. So if we do a regression analysis, we can see that if you are reducing the amount of soybean oil, that there is an environmental impact associated with that ingredient. We are reducing the environmental impact, especially of climate change and eutrophication. For acidification, it was not significant. So if you think about, I'm giving one example of one enzyme and one methodology that we've been applied for this enzyme, but this goes behind, it can be applied to other enzymes and other additives. Especially when we are thinking about sustainability, we are thinking about alternative ingredients, some formal feed ingredients. So there are a lot of things that we can start studying in those ingredients. But for that, we need to evaluate the nutritional composition of the feed ingredient. We need to evaluate the raw materials, the quality, the availability, and the price. Because when we are doing the life cycle assessment, usually we allocate for economic allocation. So the price is also important. So of course, we need to know what's the composition and also what are the availability of those ingredients. Changing a little bit the topic, so we are moving a little bit from enzymes. We can mitigate the environmental impact in different ways with enzymes, but also we can using some synthetic amino acid. So our group did a lot of studies with reducing crude protein in pigs that were supplemented with amino acids. So usually when we think about reducing crude protein in diets, every time that we reduce one crude protein %, we are reducing 10% of the nitrogen that's in the manure. So it's a huge impact if you think, okay, we are reducing the crude protein that's being fed to the animals, and what's the environmental impact of nitrogen excretion. And we performed some trials, and we can find different results depending on how much we lower those crude proteins and which phase we lower. Because the growing phase is somehow susceptible to those crude protein reduction. So when we reduced to 2.4% for the growing pink, we saw an increase in intake. So the animals start to compensate those reduction in crude protein. But for the finishing phase, we see a linear decrease in nitrogen excretion. So we can see different results depending on how much we lower those crude protein and in which phase we lower those crude protein levels. So the question still remains, how much and how? In our research group, we also do some trials with the manure. So it's not about evaluating the performance of the animals, but also what are the environmental implications, what are the nitrogen excretion, and what we can do with those manures. So for every manure that we use in those trials, we do some different experiments. For example, one for biogas production, another for ammonia volatilization, and another for greenhouse gas emissions. So this was actually the topic of my PhD, that tried to incorporate nutritional strategies and manure management. So if we're trying to incorporate the impact of lowering crude protein and using those manures to mitigate those environmental impacts. So for every research project that we develop the animal phase. For example, different nutritional strategy was used beta-manganase was using lower crude protein levels. And we evaluate what was the excretion, what was the impact on biogas production, and so on. So this, again, I'm talking about the research that we have done, but there are a lot of implications for other research groups that want to do such analysis with other enzymes and other feed additives. For the biogas trial, we already published those results, and we can see some circular economic effects. So we can see some positive impacts. So we're trying to produce the corn that will be being fed to the animals, and those animals will produce the manure that will be used to produce the electricity that will be used in the pig's house, and the manure can be also used to raise the corn. So there is like a circular economy. As a result, we can see everything that we are changing in the diets, we are changing the feeding product, we are also changing in the feces, because the manure is not only about feces, but also urine, water, and wasted food. So what we are changing in the feed program, there is also an impact in the manure composition. So we saw in those reduced crude protein diets that we also saw a reduction in nitrogen. And for biogas production, it's very important the carbon to nitrogen ratio for bacteria. So if you are trying to reduce a lot the nitrogen, there is some negative impacts on the biogas production, because the bacteria, they need nitrogen to produce biogas. Okay. We did also other trials, but I don't have the time to cover everything. I would love to address precision feeding, but it's a little bit out of the scope of this summit. But our research group also developed a lot of studies with precision feeding. And there is a great opportunity to reduce the environmental impacts using precision feeding, because we are optimizing the resource needed for a given output. So we are using less crude protein, we are using less nitrogen and phosphorus to produce the same amount of meat, for example. So we can see like a lot of reduction of nitrogen excretion, lysine in this case, It's about near 40% of everything that was ingested can be retained or wasted in the manure. But there is a big rule. One size doesn't fit all, okay? So we need to consider different systems because there is a lot of variability among piglets. To sum up, there are some nutrition challenges when we are doing some feed formulations because we need to concentrate on the cost of the feed itself and nutrition composition and nutrition requirements. So usually we formulate those feeds thinking about the least cost formulation. So everything that deviates from the least cost formulation, we are adding an extra cost to those feedings. So the question remains, who will be paying for this extra cost if you are trying to address the environmental impacts? If it's similar with the least cost formulation method, okay, there's not much to add to the cost of the feed. But if you are starting to deviate from the least cost formulation method, we are probably increasing a lot the cost of the feeding. So what will be the future of feed formulation and if you think about sustainability? So there are some studies that already address this. So they are trying to use a multi-objective formulation. So not only the economic point of view, but also the environmental point of view. So what we can combine different objectives at the same time to address both economic and environmental points of view. To sum up this presentation, so animal nutrition, especially feeding, has a direct impact on the environmental impact of pig production. There is a need for different strategies. So I mentioned some strategies focused more on enzymes, some more about supplementing with synthetic amino acids, but we can also address the environmental impact in different ways, and especially for doing some life cycle assessment. That's a well-established methodology that we can use in this kind of studies. There are some other podcasts, YouTube videos that are already available that already talk about this subject, so we can check out on the YouTube. And thank you very much for your attention.
Awesome. Thank you, Felipe, for that awesome presentation. We have one question out here from Rick. When do you think it makes more sense to include exogenous enzymes in swine diets from an economic and environmental standpoint?
Well, that's a 1 million question. I would say we need to address the performance of the animals. As I mentioned, at least 90% of the environmental impact is associated with performance. So everything that we can use to maximize performance, we need to look at. So the phytase, as an example, is a well-established enzyme. So I would say everything that you can use to maximize the performance of the animals. So it will, if we improve the performance, we're also improving indirectly the environmental impact. So I don't have a specific phase because it will depend on the system as well.
And then one question that I have, so when looking at all these different ways that we can help reduce the environmental impact, such as you mentioned phytase and protein, is there one that we as an industry probably need to have a larger focus on that we're kind of not meeting the, say, quote unquote, not meeting the expectations as much as we should be?
Well, I think that enzymes are the most important. If you think there is a world before the enzymes and after the enzymes, but these days the enzymes that are very established, so it's very hard to improve, and it's very hard to evaluate the environmental impact of using more than one enzyme. So usually we perform those life cycle assessment focusing on one enzyme, but sometimes we are using more than one. But as I mentioned, as an industry, I would say that precision feeding is the way to go because there is a labor shortage, and there are a lot of things that we can reduce the amount of resources that needed. So I didn't focus on precision feed in this presentation because the summit is about feed additives, but as an industry as a whole, I would say that precision feeding would be the way to go. It's hard because it's somehow expensive, but in the long run, maybe because the labor shortage, I think it will be a must in some cases.
Gotcha. And then it looks like last question I think that we have asked by John. Have you looked at some of the studies where food waste was fed and determined the potential for benefit from reduced methane emissions coming from landfills?
Let me think first. Well, I'm not sure if I understood very well, but I will start to explain what we did. Because when we are using the manure for biogas production, we need to increase the amount of methane that's being produced. Because the biogas is not only is methane, is CO2 and other fuel gases. So to produce a good electricity, we need to increase the amount of methane. So we are mitigating the environmental impact because we are using such methane instead of releasing to the atmosphere, we are using to produce electricity. So for biogas production, we need to maximize methane production in the biogas. We also did some trials using the manure as a biofertilizer source and also for greenhouse gases emissions. For ammonia volatilization, we can see usually when we have like more nitrogen, we have more ammonia volatilization because it's more prone to volatilize. But usually it's a matter of the quantity that's being applied. For methane specifically, that's your question, because each of the gas, the greenhouse gas, there is a different pattern. So usually in methane, the greater emission is right at the beginning. When we apply the manure in the field, there is an increase in methane emissions, and then it reduces a lot because it depends on the oxygen that being in the anaerobic condition of a given place. So usually the greater methane emission is right at the beginning when you apply in the field. So there is different ways that we can try to mitigate this application in the field. So we're trying to incorporate. So instead of releasing like in the superficial, you try to incorporate the manure. Or you can use another strategies. For example, if you are applying depending a different criteria. Usually when you are, because in Canada, in Quebec, you can apply on phosphorus. But when you are applying phosphorus, you need to use a lot of urea. So the fertilization criteria is also play a very important role because it's related with the amount of mineral fertilizer that's needed to supplement the manure that's being applied in those fields. I didn't look specifically for the landfills, but my research was more focused like as an agriculture, as used as biofertilizer. So we are trying to use that nitrogen that's being applied in the diets. Yeah, exactly. It's not in landfills. It's not being captured. So it's. I know your point, but I didn't do this in my research project. But I understand that it's another concern.
Yeah, exactly. If we want to increase methane, if we can utilize it, obviously reduce it if it's just going to be wasted into the environment. But yeah, so that'll definitely be something that probably needs looked into, but probably needs also some input from other people than just swine nutritionists for that. But thank you, Felipe. I believe that's all the questions that we have for you. So I believe that's it that we have, everything for our speakers. So to close our event, I would like to thank everyone who attended and stayed with us until the end. It's been a pleasure to have you this afternoon. And of course, I would like to thank our speakers who took the time out of their day to share all their expertise with us. And lastly, I would also like to once again thank our sponsors who made this event possible: Adiseo, Anatox, Eastman, and Essential Ag Solutions. So thank you, everyone, and have a fantastic day. I hope to see or hear from you all again very soon.
you.